Hello and welcome to your master's program, Online Learning. My name is Sandy and today's module will be about research methods. Today we're here with not just an academic in the field, but a practitioner as well. We're here with Dr. Silvio De Bono, who will be sharing his expertise on the topic.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for being here today.
Or good evening.
True. Thanks for being with us today. So my first question is more of an introductory question. What is research and why is it so important?
Well, in academia, research is a critical component. Whatever we do, we need to find out whether something exists, whether something is true, whether a hypothesis which we may have is true or false. So both in academia as well as in general life, research is a critical component which helps us to explore, to identify, to learn new things, new methods, new ideas. Research is not only used in academia, but research is also used in our daily life. We need to explore, we need to identify new things, we need to verify. We have an inquisitive mind. Some of us have more of an inquisitive mind more than others. So it is extremely important that we put research as part of our agenda to identify new things, to learn new things. This is how the human race actually learned new things. This is how we found out how we can go to the moon and back. This is, well, we haven't been to the sun because it's too hot. But we've been to so many different places. We've discovered so many different things. We've learned so many different topics. We have experimented so many different ideas, even in science, in human life, in human nature, that ultimately everything sparked off with an idea, something which somebody, somehow, somewhere thought about it and wanted to explore it. Exploring an idea, trying to find out something, is human nature. In academia, research is part and parcel of what we actually do. Why? Because the legacy of research is writing. The legacy of research is leaving something for others to read. The legacy of research is actually identifying whether something is true or false. The legacy of research is basically exploring new ideas. This is what makes academia grow. As a matter of fact, if you look around us, and this goes back to the early Middle Ages and even before that, all the libraries that we have around the world are a result of research. Now, it could be literature as well, which is also researching new ideas of how to explore language, ethical research, cultural issues. Research is not dominant only in one area, but research can be explored and identified in so many different areas, in so many different fields. Today, research has also widespread in some areas which we never thought about. For example, things which we took them very much as part of our common life, like food, for example. There's a lot of research about food. Nutrition is one of the research areas about food. If you take, I don't know, science, how we can actually live healthier and better. Sports is a research in itself. Whatever you think about, whatever we think about and we talk about needs to be researched. Research makes us learn more, makes us richer, makes us understand what goes around us, how it goes around us, and how we can participate in actually what we're doing. Now, there could be good research and bad research. There could be research which is very well planned, research which follows an academic path, and other research which is just there happening, for a short period of time. There's a whole mix-up of what research is as well. And for different people, research means something different. For example, in the commercial advertising world, market research means one thing, where basically what we're doing is we're going to the market and we're trying to identify who likes what and who prefers what, because that would help advertisers, would ultimately help companies in order to promote their product even further. That's what research means for the marketeers. For the academics, research means something which is more investigative. I don't know, for someone who's carrying out a poll, a survey before an election, research means trying to get the best idea of the voting opinions of a particular society. So research means different things for different people, but basically it is divided in two. There's academic research and business research. Business research is there for a specific purpose, for a specific period of time. And this is very, very important that we start making the difference. Anything which has to be business related, and there is a lot of business research going on. And I mean, consultants, for example, they do a lot of business research, but that is something which is something carried out for a particular period of time, for a particular product, over a period of a domain, something like that. So there's high level of specificity. And the probability is that you cannot use this research for other types of research. Or basically you can use part of it and refer to it to other type of research. This is the domain, this is the practical thing about business research. Is it important? Of course it is important. Is it something which you need skills to do it? Of course, you still need to have good research skills. You still need to have good academic skills. You still need to have good, I don't know, qualitative and quantitative skills in order to do that. So what varies is the approach. What varies is the intensity. Then you've got the academic research, and academic research takes a different play altogether. Academic research is more about ensuring generalizability. And generalizability is about carrying out research, which the probability is that kind of research which is carried out in a particular group over a sample, and we will explain later on what's a sample and the generalizability issues, that is carried out for a specific group, but the results then can be generalized over a wider group or in different circumstances. So the reason why research is carried out in academia is slightly different than why research is carried out in business. Both are important, but are different. The reporting is also different. The reporting flow of business research is more reader-oriented, is more factual-oriented, whereas the research in academia, there's a plan, there's a set of rules that one would have to follow in order to make it presentable in the most logical academic way. Why? Because in view that there is generalizability, one needs to ensure that there is high level of replicability. And these are terms which I am sure that we will discuss later on in time during this discussion.
Great, thanks. So what about framing the research? Could you give us a definition and perhaps an example of the inductive and the deductive approach to research?
Yes, probably this is the most fundamental question of research methods, and for any student who would like to pursue research. The difference between inductive and deductive research. And inductive and deductive research frames what happens next. And I can give some examples. Earlier on we said that research is about setting a question. And we can set different types of questions. For example, why do people prefer water than any other type of beverage? That is a research question. But we can ask this question, women prefer water than any other beverage. So there is a hypothesis. Is it true or is it false? In the first instance, when we have a generic question, why do people prefer to do something? Why, what, when? These are exploratory questions. Inductive research is framing an exploratory theme, trying to explore something new which we don't know anything about or we know very little about. Exploratory research is very important because exploratory research opens, very often we say it opens a Pandora's box. It opens a lot of different ideas. So the student researcher may start with an idea. Would start with an idea which may seem a little bit complex at that particular point in time. But by exploring it, by carrying out an inductive study, the student researcher will identify that that is only a small part of a much wider, bigger research. Exploratory research, therefore, helps the student to identify, to learn, to explore new ideas. It answers questions like what, why, and things like that, which therefore then requires that the methods to be adopted there varies considerably for deductive research. In deductive research, it is something, I must say, which is different. It's still a question, it's still research, but it is aimed to prove or otherwise a hypothesis. So, for example, we can say females are more organized than males. Okay, the female students would like this. Now, the male students could ask, is it true or false? So, a deductive research is when there is a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses which needs to be proved or otherwise. And that is also research, and that is also very important research. Both are applicable, and one type of research does not exclude the other. So any student reading for an MSc or other degree may find out that the two approaches are required. So there could be a research question which is more exploratory, and there could be research questions which are more deductive, so inductive and deductive. The whole point, the whole issue, which I think we need to stress even before going further, is that the direction of the study, whether the study is going to take a deductive or an inductive approach, does not depend on the student's preference, because those students who would have statophobia, and statophobia means those students who for some reason or another they fear statistics, will undoubtedly would say, okay, my research would definitely go an exploratory and I would do an inductive study, and it stops there. But the decision of whether research should take a deductive or an inductive approach is solely based on the research question. And the research question is based on the previous research that the student would have carried out. I always say that the research question, setting the research question right, is the most fundamental thing that one should look into. If you get it wrong, then the probability is that you keep going round and round in circles without actually knowing, the outcome of what you're going to do. My advice to anyone doing research is very simple. First, keep it simple. Keep your research question as simple as possible. Secondly, know through the research question the direction which you are going to take. And thirdly, once you know the direction, ensure that you're going to adopt the right research methods, which I'm sure we'll be talking about later on. Because this is part of what we as academics say in research, that there is the fine red thread. What is the red thread? The red thread is that there is a continuous statement, there's a continuum between the idea and the conclusion. And we all know that academic research takes different phases. No, it starts with the generic idea, with the objective of the study. Then it moves into the research question. Then if it is a deductive study, it would go into the hypothesis or hypotheses if it is plural. Then if it is a deductive study, you would generally have the research framework where you would have the variables. If it is an inductive study, then you wouldn't have the research framework, but you would have the research idea, more elaborate, and it could also be diagrammatic. And then you would have the sampling, and then you would have the research gathering, and then you would have the interpretation. So at that particular point in time, as you can understand, as you can realize, that the research question is a particular juncture where it leads the researcher, whether he or she is going into one way or the other.
Okay. Now I'd like to move on to different methods of research. So if you could describe the difference between the rational and empirical method of research?
Yeah, the rational method is very much business-like, where we have a particular idea and we want to develop it. The empirical study of research is very scientific. And this is the basic difference that I've started with earlier on in one of the early questions in this interview. In academic research, in academia, we generally advise students to adopt an empirical research, because empirical research would ensure that the student or anyone who's carrying out the research, even academics themselves, would use multiple methods in order to get their facts. Literature review is undoubtedly one of them, field research is another, using secondary sources which are available is another, and it's the process of putting all these different inputs together which can actually give a good critical answer as a result of your empirical research. I'm not saying that rational research is not good, and I'm not saying it's not important. In most often business commercial studies, the rational research is advisable because it's faster, cheaper, and it gives good results. Now here in academia, we're not talking about faster and cheaper, but we're talking about the ability, and this is a skill, it's a competence as well, which one needs to learn, the ability to actually have an idea, develop that idea, and test it empirically. And empirical testing means that the respective student would have to go to the field where that activity is happening. Irrespective what type of research methods the student would be taking, because when you're going to the field, you can carry out a series of interviews, you can carry out focus groups, you can carry out, I don't know, observation methods. So there are a series of methods how you can get the data. For the inductive, there's as much a number of ways how you can gather data for the deductive. The most common used is undoubtedly surveys, no? And today there are a number also of online surveys which we use both in the rational and empirical way to gather data. So the question is this, that both are important. The empirical uses multiple approaches, it is longer, and it is general for academia.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned earlier the literature review as one of the aspects of research.
Yes.
Now, I'm sure this is of great interest to our students, because especially if they're going to be writing their dissertation. Could you tell us what a literature review consists of?
Yeah, I can start by saying what literature review is not.
Okay.
Contrary to what people may think, a literature review is not a concoction, is not an accumulation of different authors put together. The inexperienced student would present his or her first literature review by actually putting a number of authors after each other, and they say, well, these are all important because directly or indirectly, willingly or unwillingly, knowingly or unknowingly, they have all referred somehow to a particular topic which is under research. That is not what literature review is all about. Literature review should answer part of the research question. So that's number one. Literature review is there to help the student and the reader contextualize the study. That's number two. Literature review is there to answer not only part of the question, but to fill in the other parts which would otherwise would not have been filled in through the empirical research. So it needs to fill in a void. Literature review is not there for the student to agree with each and every statement, and it is not there to put a number of authors together. And this leads me to how you write it, but that could be something different. So in actual fact, literature review answers these three fundamental questions. In research, there are times when there are secondary questions, because we have to say that in addition to the primary question, we are saying all this during the classroom lectures, the difference between the direct main research question and the secondary questions. There are times when the literature review also answers not only part of the main research question, but it also answers probably a secondary question, particularly that fill in that area which otherwise the empirical research would have not been actually been able to give more information to the reader. Literature review is not only used, as people may think, only in the second chapter. Traditionally, in any program, literature review is always in the second chapter. So we've got the first chapter, which is more and the opening statement. and there's a way how to write it, and generally the second chapter is always the literature review. Literature review is not only used for the second chapter statement, but it is there, first of all, because in order to get the idea, you need to have good literature. To develop the idea, you need good literature. And this is what I usually tell students. When they ask me that they want to do a research, the first thing I tell them is go and read. And after spending so much time reading, come back and tell me if you still have the same idea or whether you have changed the idea. The probability, I would say over 90% of students would come back to me and they would say, you know what, I have changed the idea, which is good. Because that means that you would have read and basically shaped your idea even further. So literature is there to shape your ideas. When you're shaping your ideas, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with each and every statement put up by other authors, because ultimately there are other authors which they have written their piece of information in a different context at a particular point in time. And when I'm saying a context and time, these are two very important domains in literature. Time, literature develops constantly. Yes, there is literature which is classical literature. I don't know if, for example, you're talking about motivation, you're obviously going to refer to Maslow and Herzberg, just to mention an example. Why? Because these are classical theoreticians which are always going to be there. But undoubtedly, over the course of time, particularly over the last decade, a lot of authors have actually developed further research in that particular field. So timely research is important. And the context, carrying out a study, I don't know, in one particular country or in one particular company varies considerably than carrying out research in a completely different country and in a different company and in a different industry. So when the student is reading literature, he or she must first understand the time and the context. Then literature also helps the student later on in time. Okay, there's the analysis chapter. I'm not qualifying the findings chapter, but the analysis chapter is when empirical research has actually been carried out, and the student is actually writing his or her analysis on the findings. That is when literature is also used to substantiate or otherwise the findings which have been empirically tested. So research is an addition to the empirical field study which the researcher is doing, in order to substantiate, in order to make it more contextual, in order to help the student give his or her main ideas of that particular study, always keeping in mind the research question, always keeping in mind the red thread that starts from the first sentence in the first chapter and then in the last chapter, the last sentence in the last chapter.
Okay, right. Now, moving on to reliability and validity. Could you define them and perhaps explain to us why they are so important in research?
Yeah, these are two very fundamental issues. And I would say they are fundamental both in the deductive and in the inductive domains. Let me start with the reliability and the validity in the deductive domain. As I said earlier on, the deductive domain is about answering a hypothesis or hypotheses, more than one. And there, in order to be able to answer that hypothesis, very often the researcher needs to get a sample. And this is where sampling comes into, because reliability and validity are highly, highly related to sampling. So if we're carrying out a deductive study, if there is a hypothesis which we need to prove or otherwise, and we're getting a sample, and there are different sampling techniques as we have clearly described in one of the sessions in this module, the researcher needs to ensure that the sampling is primarily one which reflects the general public. So if your sampling is skewed, then undoubtedly the answers which you are getting is skewed. So the first thing that we need to ensure is that the sampling is not skewed. Secondly, when we're carrying out a study deductively, we're very often using a number of different questions. Now, the researcher can either set his or her own questions, which means that the researcher has to carry out a number of exercises before actually getting to these questions. Or else can use previous questions, we call that previous models, which have been carried out by different researchers. For example, if you're testing happiness, you don't just go to the person and say, how happy are you? Because we don't test questions by using one question for a statement. So we do ask, for example, 5, 6, 7, 8 different questions to reflect the factor of happiness. Reliability needs to ensure that the sample and the questions are reliable enough that they reflect altogether, so that there is the inter-factor reliability, that altogether they reflect the factor of happiness, and that reflects society. So when we are, or the general public. So the first step is that when we're gathering data, we're ensuring that the sampling is a highly representative of the general public, of the society which we are looking into. And secondly, that the number of questions which together reflect that particular factor are reliable, so there is inter-factor reliability that put together they reflect happiness. When the student is carrying out the study deductively, there are statistical ways how to do this. Very often students laugh at this. It's called the Cronbach's alpha. It's a measure where you would test the outcome of the internal reliability, and if it gives you a particular number, usually it's above 0.7, that shows that there is enough inter-factor reliability, and therefore you can say that provided that I've collected the data in the right way, and therefore the sample is representative. Provided that there is high factor interreliability, then there is also validity in the sense that the outcome is valid and can be taken to further analysis. This is when we're actually carrying out the study deductively. So this is the difference, Sandy, between the empirical and the rational, and that's why in empirical research all these different baby steps, but at the same time they're all very important because they can qualify and quantify the end result later on. Now, so far I've only explained the reliability and the validity in the deductive approach. Now, there's also reliability and validity in the inductive. Now, inductive study, as I said earlier on, we're not answering a hypothesis here, but we are only answering a generic question. Internal reliability and validity here comes from the type of respondents to whom you are actually answering the question. So the respondents, the choice of the respondents, the language used. Whether, for example, you had to do a translation, whether you have used the primary language or the secondary language or any other language. If that has been translated and the translation is involved, then there is another process which is called the back-to-back translation. So basically the same question would have to be translated 3 times in order to ensure that the real meaning, the real answer of the real meaning of the question in the first language was not lost when actually it was translated. All these methods, even in inductive research, so the choice of the audience, ensuring that it is well represented. So here in inductive research, reliability also means that the audience represented in that research question are all there, irrespective of which methods you're using, with methods of data gathering, and interpreting their answers. So if a different language, you need to ensure that all the measures have been taken to ensure the high level of reliability and the high level of validity. And that is the process where we can say that we would have covered like the first quarter where we have gathered data. Because then the process comes what are we going to do with this data? And this is where the research analysis comes into place.
Okay, great. We briefly mentioned earlier sampling techniques. Could you give us some examples of some, please?
Mm-hmm. The sample, the two questions which very often students ask are, how many do I require? And when do I know that it's enough? And also, how I'm going to ensure that the data which I'm getting is correct. Sampling varies mostly in two frames, whether you are using a replaceable method or a non-replaceable method. The most fundamental thing about sampling is representation. Then, once that we know that the respondents are all represented, then we need to make the distinction, are we carrying out a deductive or are we carrying out an inductive? And I keep on making this difference because it needs to be fundamentally clear. If we're going to use the deductive method, then after representation, we need to know how many students, how many audiences do I need to be represented in my survey, if it is a survey or in my sample. That is therefore the second number. Then the number of questions. Then after that, we need to know how are we going to gather data. Are we going to have a unique type of sampling? Are we going to have a multi-stage sampling? Are we going to have, a sample method which would increase the possibility of having more respondents but less reliability? So the sampling methods used, whether you're going to use, for example, a face-to-face sampling method, whether you're going to use electronic media as a sampling, whether then, because these are the tools, whether you're going to use sampling which is only one cluster, whether you're going to use multi-clusters, two different clusters, whether you're going to use a generic sampling where you have a wider audience. This all depends on your research question. For example, if you want to carry out a study amongst university students, and I would say, you need, in your study, then you need to have at least 200 students. What type of sampling are you going to use there? Are you going to use a cluster sampling, one faculty? Are you going to use multi-cluster sampling, different faculties? Are you going to use different sampling techniques where you're also going to have different faculties and different years and different gender and different age group and different, different background? So these different technicalities are all part of the sampling techniques that you use. When it comes to inductive, it's a little bit more tricky here. Why? Because you don't have the same amount. Mm-hmm. Generally, and bold underlined italics, if you have hundreds of respondents required in the deductive in order to be able to do good analysis, good statistical analysis, in inductive research, you don't have so many respondents. You would have few tens if you have few tens. So there, the choice of the interviewee is even more important. The choice of the focus group personnel is even more important. Where there is the stakeholder analysis, who are the stakeholders as part of that research, which is more important, which is more critical, which is more unique, which is going to make it more valid. Students there generally, they ask one question: how do I know whether I should stop interviewing people? And the answer is very, very easy. Once you start getting the same answer, then it's a sign that even if you interview another 10, the probability you're still going to get the same answer. So that is when you realize that it's like from a inductive, using qualitative methods, you have enough data sets, data points in your research that you don't need to carry out more interviews. Each and every study is different, and undoubtedly here we're being very generic, so we need to ensure, and I need to underline this, that each and every student needs to speak directly with his or her supervisor in order to identify both the sampling techniques in the deductive research and the number required, as well as the same thing for the inductive.
Okay. And well, my last question for you today, Dr. De Bono, is about qualitative and quantitative research. Could you help us by giving the advantages and disadvantages of each?
Quantitative research is very often linked to deductive research where a hypothesis is tested. The quantitative research requires the researcher to have a defined set of variables. Usually there are four main variables at play, which are the dependent, independent, moderating, and mediating variable, and each of these variables would have their own set of items. Items are questions. A deductive study using quantitative methods is used when the question is purely a deductive one indeed, where a hypothesis needs to be tested, and therefore you cannot test this hypothesis using other methods. That is directly where a deductive study using quantitative methods of techniques needs to be used. The advantages is that it is clear. It gives the researcher a very unique defined number. It reduces interpretation. I mean, if both of us would have the same sample and would have the same data set, and we need to carry out a statistical test, and yes, throughout the programs we'll be helping students to understand these statistical tests, with the same data, with the same population, with the same answers, we're going to get the same result. So 100 students with the same data set would get the same result whether a hypothesis is true or false. That is a very major advantage. And notwithstanding the fact that students very often fear statistics and they fear the deductive approach and the quantitative approach because numbers are involved, in actual fact, it's fun because the answer is glaringly clear. Obviously you need to know how to work it out, and we'll be throughout our modules will be helping students and with statistical methods, but the answer is clear. That's the greatest advantage. It cannot be interpreted by someone else. If the p-value is less than 0.05, if you're carrying out research at 95% confidence level, for example, that's the same result for everyone. On the other hand, the qualitative research is very personal. And the researcher can feel very close to a particular setting because he or she may have a lot of prior experience to that. So some researchers may gain on that advantage over others because they can understand the context much more than others. For example, if you have researchers who are carrying out a particular study in the social area and they work in the social area, the probability is that they can understand even the body gestures much more than anybody else. So that is going to give added value, which otherwise quantitative research would not give. But again, that is a great disadvantage. The disadvantage is that the conclusions there, unless once you're doing the analysis, are very clear, and throughout the module we would have explained how to code both the quantitative and the qualitative, and how to carry out the analysis even for the qualitative using different types of coding, the logical method, the rational method, and Excel coding. So that would eliminate bias and would also eliminate sense of interpretation. Because while on one hand deductive research, a number means the same thing for different people, a qualitative answer could mean different thing for different people. So that is the advantage and the disadvantage of both. But I would say that both areas are important, both areas are critical. One, Sandy, is not exclusive of the other. So it is not the case where a researcher is using deductive, using quantitative methods and completely ignoring the other methods. There could be the case where research would employ both methods. The outcome of the deductive is the approving or disapproving the hypothesis. The outcome of the inductive is very often building a hypothesis for further research.
Okay, so that pretty much concludes the questions I have for you today, Dr. De Bono. I would like to thank you again for being with us. And
thank you.
You're welcome. So that's pretty much it for the questions we have today for the research methods module. Today we discussed inductive versus deductive methods of research. We also discussed the differences and advantages and disadvantages of quantitative and qualitative research, and we look into different sampling techniques. Thanks again, and see you next time.